Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists. This is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Tropical Storm Francine approaching hurricane strength and approaching the northern Gulf Coast, where communities in Louisiana, Texas, and other states preparing for a landfall in the next 36 hours. We are live with the latest track, latest models, and interactive Q&A on Tracking the Tropics. Welcome into the Stream Center, folks. JB here with you alongside meteorologist Rebecca Barry, chief meteorologist Jeff Berardelli. We got a lot to get to in this episode. Focus right there on the center of your screen with Francine churning in the western Gulf of Mexico. Want to let you know we are monitoring the Facebook Live comment section for your questions over the coming minutes. We're going to look for any hashtags around your screen, hashtag Hey Jeff, hashtag Hey Rebecca, hashtag Hey JB, and we'll get to your questions from Facebook Live in just a moment. But first, I want to send it over to Rebecca for the very latest here on Francine, nearing hurricane strength, Rebecca, and that's probably going to happen at some point today. Yes, we do. And Rebecca, I don't think I have a mic from you. It might be off. Okay. So why don't you come sit down and let's actually look at it here again from the seated position.
Yeah, we were just talking about how Jeff and I were just talking about how the core looks a little stronger than it did yesterday. It did encounter a lot of drier air this morning, and that really worked against it. And then we're also looking at, it's just like Jeff described, it wasn't true shear, but it's just an unfavorable environment that's kind of ripping this system apart. And so that's what we're looking at on the satellite right here. But let's go ahead and take a look at the latest. We've got Francine boiling in the Gulf and the two systems with chances to develop back out in the Atlantic, and the rest of it looking pretty quiet. And so with the latest advisory from Tropical Storm Francine, those maximum winds are right at 65 miles per hour. That minimum central pressure is 988 millibars, and it's moving to the north-northeast at 8 miles per hour. And so we do expect it to become a Category 1 hurricane later today. Now, yesterday, they predicted it would reach Category 2 storm strength before landfall, but with the latest track, they're not predicting that because we haven't seen the intensification. That drier air, especially this morning, didn't allow it to become more well organized. So it's getting its start to intensification a little bit later than what they anticipated yesterday. So it looks like it will make landfall as a Category 1, most likely in New Orleans. And when you're looking at this map, I just want to remind you the cone is just for the center. And so the effects of this system will be felt well outside the cone. Rainfall along the Texas coastline, areas to the east of the cone and to the east of New Orleans could see a lot of flooding from that as well. This will continue to be a rainmaker as it weakens and moves northward, and it'll slow down in forward motion throughout the week and into the weekend. And the forecast models generally agree until about Thursday. And at that point, some of them have it pushing a little further south, some of it staying stationary, some of them have it moving north. And so it's at that point that it loses really the fact that it is a tropical storm. At that point, it's just a low pressure system. It's just a rainmaker. It's just messy weather. When you take a closer look at the spaghetti forecast models, it's a big difference if the eye is in Lake Charles versus Morgan City, that dirty side of the storm that we talk about with the storm surge, the onshore winds and the flooding. That's where we're going to be narrowly focused when it comes closer to landfall tomorrow, because that's where the worst of it will be. And so that's still a pretty big spread, although the most consensus is over Morgan City and then to the north of New Orleans. And that would put all the areas to the east of Morgan City really on the dirty side of the storm, and New Orleans positioned pretty uniquely to have onshore winds upon landfall there in the bay that could funnel a lot of water into that bay. And we know it's flood prone. We've seen it. It's below sea level at certain points in New Orleans, and so that's just going to be a huge issue. This is your wave heights forecast, and keep in mind this is only one forecast model, but it is showing us an idea of where we might see the highest wave heights and what we could see with the wave heights. We're talking 20-foot wave heights right there on the dirty side of the storm, that northeastern side of the eye. And so it will depend heavily on where landfall ends up. And just to the east of landfall is where we'll see some of that potential really, really high seas. And so even at landfall, we're still looking at 15 to 20 foot wave heights. We don't get past that, and it starts to weaken tomorrow evening. We get down to that 10 to 15 foot wave height as it makes its way onshore. But look at the way, if this scenario were to play out exactly with the eye positioning there in New Orleans, look at those onshore winds into that bay and the wave heights that you could see in Biloxi. Even in Pensacola, things are probably going to get pretty rocky in terms of seas. And then by 2 a.m., it's looking actually a little worse in the Panhandle and in Mississippi than it is in New Orleans and in Louisiana. At that point, they're offshore winds. And so then the seas subside. But that's just one more factor in addition to storm surge that we'll be looking at with this system. And when we take a look at the forecast wind gusts, this is when it starts to get really interesting as to what side of landfall you're on, because 40-mile-per-hour offshore winds on the left side of the eye versus the 30-mile-per-hour onshore winds, that does a significant difference in terms of the level of water that you see in these bays and rivers. And so those that get the 12 hours of 30-mile-per-hour to 60-mile-per-hour onshore winds are going to see a significantly higher volume of water than those that get the offshore winds or the more neutral winds. We start to see hurricane force winds right there at 70 miles per hour by 4 p.m. tomorrow. And then we get really rocky as we head into like 5, 6, 7 p.m. That's when we see some 80 and 90 mile per hour wind gusts as it makes landfall. And so unfortunately, it does look like we could see a lot of damage from New Orleans southward and to the west there as well. That's where those damaging wind gusts are going to be. We're talking widespread power outages in the areas in purple and red, even in the yellow. Power outages certainly possible. We're looking at a lot of wooded areas once it moves away from the coastline, and typically that's where you get those longer range power outages because it's less of a population density, and so the power lines have to go for miles and miles surrounded by trees to get to those more less dense areas. And so high risk for some rainfall flooding there in red. The rainfall totals don't look incredibly impressive just from this, but we also don't have any of the forecast models right there in the heaviest areas of the rain. And so we're just looking for 1 to 5 inches of rainfall. But certainly when you add to that the storm surge we could see, the increase in volume of water as well. The ever popular Wobble tracker is up and running on WFLA.com. I want to bring Chief Meteorologist Jeff Baradelli in right now to talk about the Wobble tracker.
All right, well, it's moving. I mean, it's moving along its line now. It had wobbled a bunch. You can see it just to the southwest right there. There was a southeast wind at the surface kind of trying to nudge the storm towards Texas. At the same time, the upper level winds were trying to nudge it northeast, and so we ended up with a discombobulated storm this morning. Also, you mentioned earlier to me, Rebecca, that there was some dry air entraining into the system. Well, the system has successfully closed the dry air off, and now it's really building its core. And now we have about 18 to 24 hours of what could be rapid intensification. So luckily, it's inhibited by time and the fact that it's going to make landfall. Once it gets into the northern Gulf of Mexico, it's going to encounter some pretty strong wind shear. So I think, and this is why the National Hurricane Center initially pushes it to a 90-mile-an-hour storm and then backs it off to an 85-mile-an-hour storm as it's making landfall. It's not just land interaction. There's a ton of wind shear up near the northern Gulf Coast. So the storm has contended with some issues over the past 12 hours. We like issues when storms have to contend with them because that weakens the storm. It gives it less time to build its core and to get stronger. But we do think that this rapid intensification phase, if it happens, is going to begin right now. It will last 18 hours. And then after that, when it gets to the Gulf Coast, it's going to encounter that shear. So again, to some small degree, saved from what could have been a much worse scenario of like a Cat 4 plus around here, because that's how warm the Gulf temperatures are. But still, this is a very dangerous storm with as much as 5 to 10 feet of surge, and some isolated areas will see up to about a foot of rainfall from this system.
And so very dangerous system. I do want to move on very quickly to what else is going on in the Atlantic. But if you have any questions about Francine, of course, use those hashtags and we'll hop right back into Francine when we get to the Q&A portion of this. We're watching 2 other areas in the Atlantic, one with a 40% chance to develop a little further to the west there. And then the system in the red polygon has a 70% chance to develop. Now, the National Hurricane Center has initialized the forecast products for the one to the west that only has a 40% chance to develop. And these are the forecast models that we see. And so they generally agree on impacting the Windward and Leeward Islands, possibly Puerto Rico, and then most of them that go out that far start to hint at a turn to the north, which would save the U.S., the continental U.S., from any impact at that point. And then the only thing we have to go for with the other system, the one there in red that has a 70% chance to develop, is a comparison of the GFS versus the Euro, which generally both of them do form this system and then take it very slowly to the north, just kind of keeping it out over the open Atlantic. So kind of good news with those two systems. We are right at the actual day, the actual peak of the tropical season activity. So we still have a long way to go, but it's basically halftime. We're right here at the peak. And as far as the names go, we just ticked off the next name, Francine. We've got a tropical storm there expected to become a hurricane. If those systems in the Atlantic get named, they'll be Gordon and Helene. And when we look at where we typically see development in September, it's not exactly lining up with where the warmest waters and the most available ocean energy is. And so we may see some out-of-season development.
Yeah, so we have to watch out for what happens in October. But got to tell you, it's an anemic look in the Atlantic right now, out in the tropical Atlantic, Rebecca.
Yeah.
By now, you would expect to see not only a lot of storms, and we're watching a lot of stuff, but you would expect to see a lot of them developing. And these storms are just struggling to develop. I mean, even Francine, this is a wave that we've been watching for 2 weeks, traverse the Atlantic. It took until literally the 11th hour, right before it hit Mexico. Then it developed. And the only reason it developed is because it intersected with a front. And they collided, and that started the spin in order to get this storm to develop. So, this season has been underperforming. Now, we always say it only takes one, and we still have half because we're at peak, literally half of the hurricane season. And for the Tampa Bay area and for the Gulf of Mexico, we're getting into our busy season at the end of September and into October when we see a lot of our most powerful landfalling hurricanes. So we don't let our guard down, but as it looks in the central Atlantic, where the focus is right now, but it will shift back towards the Caribbean and the Gulf as we head into late September and October. As we look into the central Atlantic, it is anemic. Those storms have been having a hard time developing. The whole Cape Verde season has been a lot less impactful than we thought potentially it would be earlier in the season.
We're going to start to take your questions and comments. You can use any of the hashtags on your screen on any Facebook page that we're currently live on. We'll be able to pluck it out of the comment section. So if you have a question about Francine or about where we are in the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season, drop a comment in with a hashtag and we'll answer it now. It's that simple with how it works. So you can start typing in your questions now and they'll filter in to the stream center here. We'll start with this one from Caitlin. Hashtag, hey, Rebecca. Is it going to keep moving east?
It looks like a northeasterly direction. I'll pop up the track for you here. Not many of the forecast models move it any further east than the track. And so the track shows it making its way towards New Orleans. So it has that northeasterly motion in between now and then, more of a northeasterly motion right now. And after that, this official track brings it straight north. And when you compare that to the spaghetti models, once again, the spaghetti models agree until about Friday, and that's when some of them turn it back down south, some of them push it further northeast. But at that point, it's not really a storm. It's not really, certainly doesn't have any tropical storm characteristics or near the damage. So at that point, it's not really a danger at that point. It's just rain.
I think, of course, a lot of people are concerned that this could head to Florida. It shows no indication of headed towards Florida. Our part of Florida, when I say that, I mean the peninsula. Now, the Panhandle, you should continue to watch this closely in places like Pensacola because, any more shifts further east. And by the way, there is going to be some storm surge on the eastern. So there's going to be a max of 5 to 10 feet of storm surge along the Louisiana coast. But you get east of there into Mobile Bay, into Biloxi, into Pensacola, and you're still going to see several feet of surge there. So if you're told to evacuate, and there's probably going to be some low-end evacuations in those areas, especially in the western part of the Panhandle, I would say take it seriously because there is going to be significant water being pushed in. In fact, if you go forward with that one more time, Rebecca, see that? Winds are out of the south right into Mobile Bay. Now you're forcing water into that nook and cranny, and you're really starting to cause those waters to rise. And then one more step from there, I believe we even see a little bit of southwesterly flow. There it is.
Yep.
Not for very long.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, this is something that everyone from the Western Panhandle westward through Louisiana needs to watch closely just in case it tries to shift even further east. But it's not coming towards Florida.
Lacey wants to know, Jeff, how likely are we to see significant winds in Kentwood, Louisiana?
I think that it's probably a good idea to be prepared for the possibility of power outages. If you're right along the immediate coast, well, you're going to see those winds gust over 100 miles an hour, I think. Of course, we'll see how much it weakens as it moves in. But once the storms move in and they move inland, we tend to see those storms weaken pretty dramatically. So we'll probably end up with some 70, 75 mile an hour wind gusts, but it's not likely to be the kind of storm that could take down homes. It's more likely to be the kind of storm that can cause some superficial damage. But one thing that I always talk about is a lot of times there are old trees near homes that could potentially be pushed over. And by pushing over those trees into homes, that's oftentimes when we have storms that are not particularly strong, but they're strong enough to cause trees to be downed and they fall into homes, that's when we all of a sudden pretty often end up with damage and injuries.
David wants to know, Rebecca, Jeff, has a new forecast come out on the rest of the year for hurricane season?
We've had a couple of updates from Colorado State University. showing that they took their numbers down a notch here and there. We haven't seen significant updates to the others, and so this is where most of them still stand. The average is 14 storms, NOAA calling for 17 to 24, and Colorado State calling for 23.
Yeah, I think everybody realizes that this is not going to be a hyperactive season like we thought it probably was going to be. I think Phil Klotzbach from CSU still believes it's going to be a season that's above average, but that's a far cry from what was being called for at the beginning of the season by a lot of the seasonal forecasters of a hyperactive season. I think just about everybody in the meteorology community agrees we're probably not headed towards quote-unquote hyperactive, but there's still a pretty decent chance this ends up being an above normal, above average season in many respects.
Darlene wants to know, #Hey Rebecca, as Francine moves north into the Gulf, will there be effects on the Florida Gulf waters like surf and tides?
Well, the Florida Gulf waters probably not going to see too much from that. It's actually drying our forecast out just a little bit because it's pulling the moisture away from us over the Thursday, Friday time period. It's just too far away at this point to really impact our tides or anything like that, our surf. And we may have slightly higher surf as a result. I haven't seen the numbers as far as the swell goes, if we're getting enough of a bump for that to get the surfers excited or not.
And this is the last call for your questions and comments here on Tracking the Tropics. Any additional notes? Francine is likely going to be obviously a hurricane at landfall. Rebecca, what category are we expecting at landfall? I know that I was on a call with Hank Allen, the chief meteorologist at WGNO yesterday, and he was saying that a Cat 2 is a possibility.
It was absolutely yesterday a possibility, but the fact that we didn't get any strengthening overnight and really this morning either because of that drier air, it now looks like less of a possibility. In fact, it does look like it'll be a weakening Category 1 storm upon landfall. We see those 90-mile-per-hour sustained winds on this track at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, and then by landfall, at least by 8 p.m., we're looking at 85-mile-per-hour winds. And so we know it's a big difference if storms are strengthening as they make landfall versus weakening as they make landfall in terms of the damage that you see. And so that is a positive note that we're not seeing it churning up to that Category 2 storm right before landfall.
And we have a question that's coming in here from Christy Matthews, and I'm going to do a little bit of Googling here because I believe it's Nederland, Texas, if I am pronouncing that correctly, Jefferson County. Christy wants to know about that area, and that's going to be really just southeast of Beaumont. And give me guys just kind of lower Jefferson County is currently in a tropical storm warning.
Yeah.
And it's really right there on the state line between Louisiana and Texas, you guys.
Yeah, so, it's difficult for a storm that is moving in the direction that this storm is moving to have a big impact on this particular part of Texas. We think this is going to landfall significantly to the east, which means you're going to have a lot of offshore flow. Something that a lot of us here on the Gulf Coast are familiar with is reverse storm surge. Now, at first, there's onshore flow there because the storm is still to your south. But as the storm really gets going overnight tonight, that wind is going to switch away, and you can actually see it right there. Do you see how in the western part of Louisiana we have offshore wind flow? So we'll probably end up with reverse storm surge. The worst of this storm is going to be significantly east of where you are, and that means that's where the worst rain is going to be and also where the worst storm surge is going to be. It's worth mentioning that along the path of this storm, we're going to see record high precipitable water. So what is precipitable water? It's just atmospheric moisture content. Because the Gulf waters are record-shattering hot, they are forcing a lot more water into the atmosphere. So the atmosphere essentially is becoming a bigger sponge. And so you can see the high risk for flooding there, despite the fact that this storm is moving very fast, and it is moving pretty quickly, which is going to be a saving grace for some areas. It is going to drop a lot of water in a short period of time, so I do think we're going to see significant flooding because of that. And it's going to be especially confined to where the actual center of the storm moves across. And we may see some of that in Baton Rouge and maybe western parts of New Orleans as well. As we zoom in, you can see where the heaviest rain is. And again, those particular areas can't necessarily receive a lot, especially the urbanized areas. That water just runs off and causes flooding. So you can see those darker shades right underneath the New Orleans area right there, and just to the west, especially of New Orleans. Again, we saw it here in the Tampa Bay area a couple of times this year. We've had record high amounts of atmospheric water, and because of it, A lot of people in our area have been saying, I've never seen flooding like this. Something has changed. Something is different. Well, a lot of it is just because we have this record high amount of water in the atmosphere and the rainfall rates are very high. So what I mean by that is you're getting like 3 to 4 inches an hour rather than 2 to 3 inches an hour. And that makes a difference because your infrastructure is built to withstand 2 inches an hour. But once it gets to 3 and 4 inches an hour, then all of a sudden the water's got nowhere to go and it causes these really bad floods. We saw it in Tampa. We saw it in Sarasota.
A question here from Ariel about Macomb. Now that's in Mississippi, southwestern Mississippi, south of Jackson, and really approaching Baton Rouge, really probably the halfway point between the two. So a little more inland, but right there along I-55.
You know, JB, I think for that particular area, wind is probably not going to be a great concern. I would be a little concerned about the possibility of tornadoes. Essentially, you're going to be on the northern end of the storm as it moves in. But one thing you need to remember is that as a storm moves inland because of friction, it loses a lot of its wind very quickly. So you end up with these monstrous gusts near the coast, but you go just 20, 30 miles inland, and all of a sudden, it's just a run-of-the-mill tropical system moving on shore. I would say, again, the same thing. Worry about any trees that might be weak trees on your property. Make sure you put anything inside that could potentially cause problems and blow around, because you can get those wind gusts to 60, 70 miles an hour. But I don't think you're going to see those wind gusts in Macomb, at least, that get past 80 miles an hour.
And that's going to do it for our stream here on Tracking the Tropics. Our coverage continues on WFLA.com, trackingthetropics.tv, or, of course, your Nexstar-affiliated website or app. We'll, of course, be keeping close tabs on Francine as it likely hits hurricane status at some point today and makes landfall tomorrow, Wednesday, September 11th, right here at the peak of hurricane season. For Chief Meteorologist Jeff Baradelli, Meteorologist Rebecca Barry, I'm JB Buno. We'll see you next time here on Tracking the Tropics.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.